Thank you for joining us today for our Volume 20 celebration. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgement announcements. The first is that Smith College stands on Nonotuck land. I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Let us also acknowledge the 4.5 million people claimed so far by COVID-19 worldwide, and the 219 million who have been sickened by the virus, especially those who continue to suffer from long COVID and other after effects, including grief over the loss of loved ones. I'd like also to acknowledge the people of Texas who have been made targets for state-sanctioned and funded vigilantism against women's bodily autonomy, and to offer solidarity to all of those who continue to struggle against fascism, fundamentalism, and patriarchal violence of all kinds. Let us also acknowledge the tens of thousands of migrants, hundreds of thousands, of migrants, exiles, and refugees of political regimes and global climate change worldwide who've had to suddenly leave their homes on a wing and a prayer. May they be welcomed and supported wherever they find themselves. Finally, we especially wish to acknowledge anti-Muslim and Islamophobic racism worldwide. We just take a moment, please. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today to the Meridians counter-hegemonic 9/11 20th anniversary commemoration event, which features the contributors to our forthcoming Fall 2021 Volume 20, Number 1 special issue. This issue, which was guest edited by Sherene, Razack, and Zeynep Korkman, is dedicated to feminist responses to global anti-Muslim racism. In light of how pervasive anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobic ideologies, discourse, and rhetoric are, how heightened they have become during significant anniversaries such as this one, and how often imperialist and interventionist policies are justified by claiming that protecting Muslim women is a central motivation, here at Meridians, we are taking this opportunity to give voice to feminist scholars and knowledge producers who offer important challenges and correctives to those hegemonic ideologies, rhetorics, and discourses. Thus, it is my pleasure to open this event by introducing you to our staff. I am Ginetta Candelario. I'm the editor of Meridians. I'm also a faculty member and full professor in the departments of Sociology, Latin American Latino Studies, the Study of Women and Gender program, and the Community Engagement and Social Change concentration. Melinda.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melinda Buckwalter, and I am the editorial assistant here at Meridians. I have 15 years of editorial experience with Contact Quarterly, a dance and improvisation journal, and we shared there the interest in mentoring new writers and bringing writers who weren't usually people who were into scholarship necessarily and really helping them to get their work published. So I'm excited to bring those skills to Meridians. Thank you.
Kyla?
Hi, yeah, I'm Kyla. I'm the Stride Fellow with Meridians. I've been working with Meridians for a year now, and I am a sophomore student at Smith College studying environmental science and policy. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and to meet you all.
Thank you both, Kyla and Melinda. As always, I think you all know that it's the people who do the work behind the scenes that make these events and essentially everything we do possible. So in lieu of formal presentations or talks, today we will be having a collective conversation in which our 2 guest editors and 13 authors have been invited to respond to questions I will be asking. In order to ensure that everyone get an opportunity to speak at least once, and since our event is only 90 minutes long, not everyone will answer every single question. Instead, I ask that 3 or 4 of our guests answer any given question until everyone has had an opportunity to share at least some of their thoughts. We ask you, the audience, to either hold your question or put them in the chat while we compile them, and that we will be taking 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. Now, to our participants, our contributing authors, could you please each introduce yourselves briefly, beginning with Sherene and Zeynep, and then each person passes the baton or calls on someone else to introduce themselves until everyone has done so. In your introduction, please state your name clearly and loudly, your discipline, your university affiliations, where in the world are you sitting in this moment, and what is the name of your piece, with a very brief 1 or 2 sentence abstract of what is in that contribution. I'll turn it over to Sherene.
Okay, I'll start. Welcome to everybody. Thank you, Ginetta, and thank you, Meridians, for organizing this wonderful forum. We haven't seen, some of us don't know each other, so it's been really exciting. Some of us do. I'll introduce myself as the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Gender Studies at UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles. I'm presently in Toronto, not in Los Angeles, where my grandchildren live. I would describe myself as a critical race scholar. My scholarship is entirely dedicated to the study of racial violence. I am a North Americanist, but really there's no way to be a North Americanist because you have to study global circuits of power. And it's exactly that situation that led to the collaboration between Zeynep, Korkman, and myself, because we discovered as colleagues that when you look at something like anti-Muslim racism, you're actually, her position as a scholar of Turkey and my position as a scholar looking mainly at North America really produced sort of very different analyses. And we were seeking some kind of common ground to ask questions about Muslims as a global enemy at the moment, and trying to think about the historical routes along which anti-Muslim racism travels, but also the global circuits along which it travels, which is exactly what led us to Meridians, because immediately one had to think about transnational feminism and to think about what a transnational feminist analysis of anti-Muslim racism would actually look like. And so that brought us together, and Zeynep, who I hope is on now and following me, will definitely explain, but it was her brainchild to keep thinking about translations and mistranslations that occur as we attempt to theorize anti-Muslim racism. So we had a symposium, which some of you were at, and this led to this journal issue.
So Sherene, remember that we're going to come back to that question actually. And so right now I'm just asking folks to introduce themselves. Okay. As our other contributors come into the room, we might also pause and give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, including Zeynep. So who should go after you now to introduce themselves, Sherene?
Well, really anybody. If Zeynep's not on, is she? I can't.
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Okay, so maybe any of the other contributors, Minoo, Amina.
Okay, so Minoo, and then Minoo, you pick the next person, but go ahead, please, Minoo.
Of course. Hi, everybody. Before I introduce myself, I would like to thank Sherene and Zeynep for organizing the workshop and for working hard on putting together this volume. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this group and part of this volume. I also would like to thank Meridians and Ginetta and other colleagues who organized this event. My name is Minoo Moallem. I am a professor of gender and women's studies and the director of media studies at University of California in Berkeley. I live in Berkeley. I work mostly from a transnational and post-colonial feminist perspective. I work on feminist cultural studies, Middle Eastern studies, and Iranian cultural politics and diaspora. And I have done a lot also on commodity cultures. I teach courses such as transnational feminism, objects, commodities, diaspora, borders, and transnational identities. The piece I contributed to this volume is called Race, Gender, and Religion, Islamophobia and Beyond. And it's focusing on anti-Muslim racism as a discourse that collapses race, gender, and religion. And that cannot be reduced to either phobia or the temporality of 9/11. Very briefly, I can talk about it a little more further. How about Ellora?
Hi, thank you. I thought Amira was going to go. I'll choose Amira next. Thank you, Minoo. Thank you to the editors, Sherene and Zeynep, and of course the whole Meridians staff. I know Ginetta wants to keep us on time, so that's it for my thanks. My name is Ellora Shehabuddin. I teach at Rice University in Houston, Texas, where we are dealing with the aftermath of everything, but good news from Mary Garland, hopefully. And also a reminder that, you know, this is not restricted to Texas. This can happen in any of the states now because the Supreme Court could have done other things about this. So let's see, my piece for the issue is, I'm professor of transnational Asian studies and core faculty in women, gender, and sexuality studies here. My training is in politics, which is the name I preferred to political science in the department I was in for graduate school. But I've tended to be interdisciplinary always, and I also draw on transnational feminism in my work. My book, which came out 2 weeks ago, is a long history looking at how Western feminism and Western feminists and Muslim feminists have basically co-constituted, how they've developed in tandem. And it's a long history from before Mary Wollstonecraft down to the present, and looking at moments of encounter and interaction. So my interest is in a historical approach to this. So my piece for the volume is titled, sorry, I have to look it up because it's between Orientalism and anti-Muslim racism, Pakistan, the United States, and women's transnational activism in the early Cold War interlude. And the argument is really that since 9/11, and I think we can talk about this later, and we've talked a great deal about how Muslim women have been seen as oppressed historically. And I wanted to draw attention to this interlude during the Cold War, where US policies towards Islam were very different, and hence their representations of Muslim women and their interactions with Muslim women were very different for this brief interlude. It changes, of course, in the late 20th century. I think I've answered everything. And Amira, please go next.
Thank you so much, and congrats on your book. I am Amira, Jarmakani, she, her, and I'm also good with they. I am in women's gender and sexuality studies at San Diego State University, also identify with critical ethnic studies, critical Swana studies, and other areas. Affiliated with the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies at San Diego State, and also the Digital Humanities. I am, where in the world am I? I'm on unceded Tongva land in Los Angeles currently. And the title of my piece is Sharia Barbies Afterlives, Apprehending Racialized and Sexualized Islam Through Social Media. So in it, what I look at are some memes that circulated, and one of the memes was about so-called Sharia Barbie. I just looked at that circulation of memes, thinking about this idea of going viral, but putting that in the context of the circuits of this, what some have called the Islamophobia industry, and the way that networks of heteronormative, racist, Orientalist discourse, and captured through data, big data, algorithmic kinds of capturing mechanisms, basically serve to apprehend Muslims. So, and when I say apprehend Muslims, I'm really thinking about like at least 3 meanings of that word. And so I think this kind of encapsulates really the argument in the article. One, thinking about literal apprehending, like through criminalizing, but also through apprehending through this idea of knowing about, right? And so the way that knowledge and knowledge production participates in criminalizing, thinking about like the gathering of, intelligence, militarism, and these sorts of things that certainly have been around since well before 9/11. I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, but also have really been sped up in terms of how they've been operating to apprehend Muslims recently and since in the past few decades as well. And then the third meaning would just be about, if we think about apprehension, so the way that fear and perpetuating fear about Muslims is part of how capturing and apprehending Muslims happens. So that's what my piece does in a nutshell. And I think actually the person that Sherene had mentioned was Amina, so I will pass to Amina next.
You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you, Amira, and thank you, Sherene and Zeynep, for this really very timely and much needed issue, an issue that just doesn't go away, as we know, with recent events in Afghanistan and its flow over into Pakistan. I won't go into that too much now. My name is Amina Jamal, as you can see, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Sociology. Well, many of us who work at Ryerson University, faculty, staff, and students prefer to refer to our institution as X-University in solidarity with Indigenous students and faculty who are protesting Ryerson University's name as a symbol of cultural genocide and intergenerational trauma. According to our Indigenous colleagues, the X indicates assent under duress for Indigenous people. And so the land where I'm speaking from is Toronto, which is on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people. My piece is called Feminism, the Entanglement of Feminism and Secularism in Pakistan. And it speaks to a very long and ongoing debate about feminism's complicity with secularism and the problematic subjectivity of feminists, such as in Pakistan and Muslim societies themselves, those who call themselves feminists and speak in the name of feminism, and how their subjectivities are, I would say, misunderstood by diasporic, even by feminists themselves. And so I guess my piece really speaks to a larger project about the Islam, the constructed Islam secular dichotomy, which I think itself is a project of Islamophobia. So I think it is an indication of systemic Islamophobia, even to think of Muslim women through this lens. So that's, I think I've said what I needed to, and I will pass it on to Tatiana.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Sherene, Zeynep, Ginetta, and the Meridian staff for, birthing this beautiful and timely edition of Meridians. And I thank Sherene and Zeynep for inviting me to be a part of this fantastic conversation about global anti-Muslim racism. So my name is Tatiana Rabinovich. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a postdoctoral scholar at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. I am a part of the Interdisciplinary Studies program. My training is in Middle Eastern Studies, Gender, Women's Studies, and History. But then my research led me to my home country, to Russia. And this piece came out of my ethnographic research in St. Petersburg that I conducted between 2015 and 2017. My piece for this volume is called Becoming Black and Muslim in Today's Russia. And in this piece, I look at how global anti-Muslim racism takes new and specific forms in contemporary Russia by mobilizing the shifting meanings of Blackness and whiteness to stigmatize vulnerable populations. And these meanings of Blackness and whiteness, they stem from the Tsarist and the Soviet pasts, and they have been refracted by the dramatic socioeconomic and political shifts since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And like I said, this article is based on the accounts of working class devout Muslim women with whom I conducted my ethnographic research. And I look at how these women's experiences of anti-Muslim racism and their responses produce burgeoning solidarities that sustain those communities targeted by racism.
And unmute myself. Zeynep, thank you. I'm glad you were able to make it and just in time. So we're going to ask you to introduce yourself by stating your name, your discipline, your affiliation, where in the world are you joining us from? And we know that you're the guest editor, so the title of your piece is Introduction. But if you could introduce yourself.
So happy and excited. I apologize everyone for delay. I'm so happy and excited to be here and to have everyone in the audience together. So excited to have everyone. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm in the Gender Studies Department of University of California, Los Angeles, along with Sherene. And yeah, really excited to see everyone together today.
All right, thank you so much, Zeynep. So for our audience members, the bios, article abstracts, and the link to the issue will be put in the chat for more information. And these will also be available on our Meridians website under the On the Line feature, along with today's recording. So I'm just going to head and jump in and start with my first question. This year, Meridians celebrated its 20th anniversary. Although officially the anniversary was last fall, but you know, the pandemic, so we celebrated in May. As I reflect on those 20 years of history and my own relationship with the journal, first as an author, then as a reviewer, and now as editor, I'm curious to learn more about your experiences, Zeynep and Sherene, of and with Meridians. So could you tell us why you chose Meridians as a home for your work?
I think I've said my piece a bit prematurely, so I will pass it over to Zeynep right away to explain why we thought a transnational feminist analysis was what we wanted to do, and that Meridians was the place to do it.
Okay, thank you, Sherene. So in our conversations and thinking together, as we started thinking together with Sherene as to the anti-Muslim racisms and feminist responses to it, it has become increasingly apparent to us that the locales from which you're speaking, both in the sense of kind of thinking about different national contexts, but also thinking about them in context of global anti-Muslim racism as a transnational phenomena, demanded both the kind of a real tackling of the circus, of the patterns, of the ways in which institutional, discursive, and otherwise that this form of racism and resistance to it have circulated, but also really at the same time required holding the specificity, locality, historicity of the particular ways and places in which this globally circulating form of racism has taken shape, gets articulated with local projects of imperialism, with local projects of, with local formations of race and ethnicity, class, so on and so forth. So, and we were, of course, adamant to do that in a, from an anti-racist feminist framework. We were really interested, and I was really excited to find in Sherene a co-conspirator and co-thinker to think this way, with the particular translations and mistranslations of our transnational feminist politics. As we try to be in solidarity, we try to understand different contexts, and we try to act upon these different contexts together as feminists. And one of the key pieces that came in with that was to think about how Muslim women, as we have come to, of course, say this many times, but we find ourselves again and again, having to say this again, are not the static group that is produced and stabilized at a particular conjuncture and then kind of can be assumed as a universal concept that travels to help our understanding of the world. And similarly, even for the concept of anti-Muslim racism. So to avoid essentializing these categories, while at the same time still trying to forge a transnational understanding and politics of this phenomena, we wanted to insist on a transnational feminist analysis that is also attentive of the nuance and specificity, and to help build more resilient transnational feminist solidarities and more nuanced understanding. And we have arrived at Meridians, I think, with the knowledge that Meridian's core mission has involved such a dedication to do exactly that kind of anti-racist transnational feminist analysis, and that it would give us the right audience and the right medium to offer such an intervention in just a crucial moment, not just because of that our issue is so timely on the anniversary of 9/11, but also because of different ways in which ongoing colonial projects have continue to depend on that kind of essentialized Muslim woman, and even our progressive feminist and sometimes on transnational feminist responses not rarely happen to reproduce that construction. So we wanted to make that intervention not only to the anti-Muslim racism and its politics, but also an intervention into transnational feminist understandings and responses to that. So for all those reasons, we are very excited to have all this brilliant group of scholars contributing and us being the lucky co-editors of this issue at Meridians.
Thank you, Zeynep. Sherene, do you want to say anything else? Because I know you did start, but I don't want you to feel like you should have.
No. Zeynep has captured it entirely. And I would just emphasize that our conversations started as a conversation about race and racism. And the minute you say that with some of the people around here, I'm thinking of Amina, Jamal, and people who work at different parts of the world, there's immediately the question, well, what does racism look like in the context we're operating in, and how do you identify it? So that was the impetus behind all of this.
Would anybody else like to say? Oh, go ahead. Yes, I was going to say.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to ask if I could jump in. Also timely and related to Meridians, I think, is an article that I can remember when I was first teaching, trying to find and struggling to find. I finally found it, this statement, Transnational Feminist Practices Against War. And Meridians has republished, if I'm not mistaken, fairly recently, this essay, and we have two of the authors here with us, Moallem and Paola Bachetta. I hope I've gotten your name correct. So I feel like, I don't know if any of you have anything to say about how Meridians came to republish the essay, but it's, for those of you who are not familiar, it was a statement that came out directly in the aftermath of the US invasion of Afghanistan, and covers so many aspects of what is problematic about these so-called anniversaries. I mean, they are anniversaries, but also, anyway, we can say more about that later, but but I think just as we're hearing so much about withdrawal and the anniversary of 9/11, to return to it.
To follow up on, can I say something? To follow up on Amira's comments, I think Meridians has created a forum for the publication of different genres of critical and creative work within a transnational framework. And while some feminist organizations stayed silent or supported the occupation of Afghanistan under the banner of ending gender apartheid in Afghanistan, Meridian actually published a few essays, a few collective writing immediately after 9/11 that challenged militarism, war and occupation and imperialism, including an essay we wrote collectively with some of my colleagues, as well as another essay by another group of scholars, as well as an essay a statement that I wrote, because at that time I was working on really challenging the circulation of Islamic fundamentalism in the context of the US and Europe. And I wrote a piece called Whose Fundamentalism? Basically raises that question, and Meridian published that as well. So I could say you really appreciated the kind of space Meridian has created for transnational feminist scholarship, engagement with issues of race. So that it's a wonderful place. And I have been using Meridian's various contributions in my teaching regularly.
Thank you, Minoo. And you're reminding me, perhaps Kyla or Melinda will put in the chat there for you, that what you're referring to is that this is our 20th anniversary reader, which we published to mark the 20th anniversary. And it, in fact, includes the pieces that you've mentioned, and also an amazing speech by Sunita Fulani, who was also at the anniversary. So I encourage folks to go take a look, because, and Paula Giddings, who's here with us today, also was one of those contributors. Exactly that. Meridians knew at that point that it had to respond to what was happening in real time. I believe Kumkum Bhavnani was the editor at the moment, and that she may have organized everybody and requested those submissions. So, so what we're doing today is simply, a continuation of Meridian's longstanding commitment and mission. So I'm going to ask another question, which is related to that. What role, if any, do activism and protest play in your work as scholars, writers, artists, knowledge producers? And what role can Meridians play in supporting you in that work? I'm going to ask someone who hasn't spoken yet to jump in on that one, I hope. Activism and protest.
I'll go. I write about activism and protest and trace it historically, so it's part of what I do. And on the other side, one of my efforts with this book was to make it accessible to a larger audience. So, they're marketing it as academic trade, etc. But to write for a larger audience. So I was very heartened when you mentioned at our other meeting that you have the website, the page, which is publicly available. So to me, that's very important, to make our work available for people who may not want to read the academic versions, or who may not have access, because of paywalls, et cetera, to the academic version. So that is important to me. So one is the study of activism and protest, and the other transnationally and historically, so vertical and horizontal, but also making the work that we do so important, available to a larger audience, because there's a lot of popular work out there about the things that we care about that is inaccurate and misleading and pernicious even. So I think it's very important for our work to get out there in whatever means possible. You're muted, Ginetta.
Sorry about that. Someone else, Tatiana or Amina?
I have to unmute myself. So yeah, I'd be happy to go sometimes. Well, we all have different trajectories towards into academia, and I don't know if I was an activist, but I worked as settlement services, immigration in Toronto when I first moved here. And then I devoted myself to academic work for a long time, but sometimes we are pushed back into activism. And given the situation in South Asia, I've also been writing about the women's movements and Islam and secularism, but the rise of Hindu extremism in India, Hindutva, and then corresponding to the increasing religious Islamic extremism in Pakistan, which has taken on a very, very misogynist turn, sort of impelled some of us to challenge hegemonic notions of South Asia in diasporic situations, especially in Canada. And so a group of us got together last year And earlier this year, we organized a symposium on critical diasporic South Asian feminisms in Canada, and we brought together a group of women from different parts of South Asia, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, and others, and also gender diverse folks, because queer people are also seriously endangered in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also in India, wherever there's religious extremism. And so we had the symposium, and we are planning to now reach out and send a call for papers, similar to what Sherene is talking about with this one. And this group was really just to examine ourselves and reflect on how we may be reproducing those notions of South Asianness and diaspora. So for academics and activists, because we do that too when we talk about only India, when we think of India as the only South Asian identifier of South Asian identity, when we neglect to speak about other Muslims, when we talk about Islam, other than the Hanafi, Sunni, male dominant version of Islam. So when we forget that there are large numbers of Hakka, Chinese people living in India and Pakistan. And so we've been trying to expand that. This group has, in fact, today published a statement. Some of you all might know that there's a anti-Hindutva conference happening in, I think, California, and at York University in Toronto. So we're just doing it in an informal way as a collective, just issuing statements on events that happen in South Asia, but because they never stay there. All these have a way of penetrating into our own networks and feminist classrooms and everywhere. So,
Amina, could you put the links to the statement or some of the things you mentioned in the chat, please?
Sure, I'll do that. Yeah, thanks. So that's all I think I can say for now.
Tatiana?
Yes, thank you. So in my work, like I said before, I look at how working class devout Muslim women in St. Petersburg respond to different forms of precarity. And they do it through different forms of care labor, right? Not this kind of open resistance, right? But through caring for themselves, caring for their community, caring for non-human others. Establishing different mutual aid projects and solidarity projects, performing different form of mothering. And it is very important for me to understand why, and I mean, it's clear why they are reluctant to come out and join political movements who are trying to push against draconian security state that Russia is, push against economic precarity, right? But these women choose other ways to live political life, right? Through that affective and material care labor that they do. It was very important for me to participate in that as I was doing field work and as I do my follow-up research with them, and to be able to tell their struggles and their stories and their experiences of anti-Muslim racism, of economic precarity, of marginalization. And the Meridians was the wonderful platform to do that. And again, I'm so grateful that Sherene and Zeynep invited me to be a part of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tatiana. All right, shifting gears just slightly, as we are here now in the 20th anniversary of 9/11. You wrote your pieces and submitted them, some of you over a year ago. How are you thinking about those pieces differently, if at all, in this moment? Are there things you would change, expand upon? I mean, since everybody's had a chance to speak, I'm just going to open the floor to whoever would like to respond to that one. Has this moment changed your thinking about your piece?
I didn't want to take up too much space, but I just wanted to explain the links that I put in the chat, and they were related to the protest question. So I think super important. I just went along thinking about data and surveillance and those sorts of things. I think, you know, organizing and these sorts of things are really supremely important and informative for the work that we do along those lines. I work with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, but I also am a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective, and those are the links that I put. So one is a love letter that was produced, a love letter to our people in Palestine, and another is a toolkit, and I can't claim any credit for either the work on either one of those, but they're really wonderful resources. So I just wanted to mention those. Yeah. And then the question you actually asked was, how are we thinking about our pieces differently now, which I think also relates to, you know, these questions too.
Well, go ahead though. Can you say a bit about that, Amira? Like,
I don't feel like I've been thinking about it differently. I mean, I'm always thinking about it differently. I've recently revised, I think. So that's also part of the context, just in terms of publishing trajectories. But I guess I just only say that because I feel like, also looping back to that Transnational Feminist Practices Against War, I'm teaching it again and thinking about it also in relation, for instance, to this term that has been floating around, Texas Taliban, you know, thinking about all of the assumptions behind that term and what people are meaning by it, and how that piece had already said, and how we've been talking about now for decades. What does, and Amina Moallem in the piece, whose fundamentalism also, you know, the question of like, what does fundamentalism even mean? How does it get deployed as a category? And this is just ongoing. So I feel like, you know, as I'm thinking of this metaphor of going viral, which relates to the memes, it's kind of really horrifically also present with us, and literally, right? And this idea of virality, but just to think about how viruses, of course, you know, mutate and get updated, but they're really sort of working with the same DNA in a lot of ways.
thank you. Someone else want to reflect on, because, you know, publishing, it is a long arc. It's not journalism, academic publishing. And in fact, we got this issue out in record time. Normally, we can't do that. We can't get something to press in, you know, less than 6-7 months, which is what this was. But nonetheless, there is still a space of time between when you're writing it, thinking about it, sending it along, and so forth in this moment. Has anything shifted in your thinking or been amplified by the moment? Somebody else?
I think I would just sort of pick up on something Amira alluded to. I don't think I would change anything in my own piece. It's historical. It's, you know, set in the 50s and 60s. But I think what the anniversary reminds us is how little has changed despite all the work we've been doing. And I think that is a great source of disappointment. And that's why I was talking about accessibility and writing for a larger audience earlier. And, you know, I don't write op-ed pieces. I don't know how to write on, you know, like such short things and do a quick turnaround. I've tried, I've done all the courses, I've done all the op-ed, you know, I still am not able to make myself do that. And I want more academics to be able to do that. But I think for me, it's more like 20 years. They've been, you know, the statement came out 20 years ago, and I think we're still teaching the same thing to our students, but the general public isn't listening, our policymakers, the way, you know, you'd think. I think 20 years ago would have thought, oh, 20 years from now, this will all be resolved, and that hasn't happened. And I think, to me, that's really upsetting that here we are having the same conversations in public again. So sorry, I'm being a downer.
No, I think that's exactly right. And so I'll say that when I was organizing the 20th anniversary event, one of the other contributors to the Reader is Lisa Majaj, whose piece was on Writing in Return about Palestine. And that was exactly the same thing she said, that this is still the issue, right? That this has not changed. So there is a, you know, I think there is a truth to that, right? Around these questions, and particularly related to, you know, anti-Muslim and Islamophobic everything, rhetoric, policy, practices, you know, frame, etc. Yeah.
Yes. When I think about what we wrote after 9/11, and I think about 20 years of occupation of Afghanistan, bombarding villages, killing villages, and so on, I get really angry. You know, I think that we went to Afghanistan, and then 2 years after to Iraq, we occupied these countries without any justification, and we created this huge spectacle of violence. And now we are, you know, we are leading, of course. So, and as if, you know, Taliban are exactly the same force that they were 40 years ago when we started to invest money in them and support them because they were fighting against communist Russians. And then, you know, when we started in the last 20 years to bombard villages and kill people, and Taliban went to help them, and we actually created, you know, Taliban as a force which would be protecting these villages. So now we are again back to this discourse of going and saving Afghani women, as if, you know, Afghani men, children, other people are not beings, and the, you know, environment in Afghanistan that is being destroyed by war and militarism is not important. So it's just, as Ellora and Amira said, everything is, many things are still the same. However, I think our imperial mission have become way more blatant, way more, you know, we are way more blatant in saying that we need to go and, you know, save this and save that and export democracy to this part of the world. We are basically, you know, just talking about the Middle East and North Africa. You have Libya, you have Yemen, you have Palestine, you have Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on and so forth. So it's just the imperial project is there. And of course, various forms of fundamentalism that we always like refer to Muslim fundamentalists. And even, you know, we don't think about ISIS and, you know, Al-Qaeda that had nothing to do with Afghanistan or Iraq, and, you know, our allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and, you know, where they were way more invested in that any others are. But the concept of fundamentalism is being circulated again, right, without any understanding of local knowledge and what has happened and what has historically happened. And I'm really, you know, afraid, because my students, now I'm teaching again these statements in my class, but some of my students were not even born during 9/11. And our historical, we have a very problematic relationship in the US with remembering, right? With remembering, everything disappears so fast. And it seems to me I have to put a lot of effort in talking about 9/11 as a moment which led to the writing of that statement. And then, you know, you have this 20 years that are gone, and things are relatively the same. And also, I think I would be I would be very concerned about silences within many, not everybody, and not all gender women's studies, not all feminist studies, but some. You know, that kind of silence worries me a lot. So that's what I wanted to do.
Thank you, Minoo. I can't help but point out that some history they want to preserve forever, such as Confederate statues, right? Like those, they'll fight tooth and nail to keep. I mean, I think your hand was up, or you wanted to contribute something?
I'd like to, unless somebody else
I think Zeynep's hand was up a while ago.
Okay, sure, yeah.
No, it's okay. I'll let Amina speak first, and then I'll jump in.
So I just wanted to say that things do seem to be the same, but they're actually not really the same, because I teach in Toronto, where we have downtown Toronto, where in many of my classes, Muslims, racialized students, Black students seem to, are almost, there are quite a number of them. And these are people who have grown up, many of them are after 9/11. And I think in some ways, maybe feminists have held on to our, especially diasporic feminists, which I am too, but maybe I came later, but I think maybe we need to start thinking about, maybe this is a time to and Sherene will, I'm sure we have this ongoing discussion, but maybe we need to think beyond, our own struggles with, around anti-racism and racial violence, which I do totally acknowledge, and which I do agree does have, is significant wherever we are in the world, because colonialism and imperialism still exists. But I think we also need to look at the scholars from other places who are now such as Singapore and others, Bubani and others, who are saying that we need to see the global shift. Might be the end of the Western European. It's going to not happen in our lifetime, but there's definitely a global shift happening. And maybe many people in many other societies, Pakistan and China and others, are seeing this, the defeat of the Americans which is what it is, by the Taliban, as the second defeat of this superpower, and probably just as the Afghan war destroyed the Soviet Union, many people are arguing that will never be the same again, no matter how much the US wants to believe that it will be. So on the one hand, we have to look at those global realities. We don't know what will come next, but we need to think about what that means. I'm not, and so we have to be careful about maybe about not buying into that xenophobia and going on with this US, pretending that the US is still a superpower, which is not to say not challenging imperialism. At the same time, from the point of view of many people, 9/11 was not the beginning of how to think about women's status definitely in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan. 9/11 was just another event. And for many of us in Pakistan, it was actually, the war started in 1978 when the US got involved in a proxy war with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So there was a lot of collateral damage for women's rights since we are feminists talking about feminism. There was a lot of damage for women's rights. And what we previously called fundamentalist groups, and there's somebody called it post-Islamism. These are not fundamentalists anymore. These are militant groups. We have to see them as such. The Taliban is a militant group. No, and to say, yes, the Taliban seem to have changed, but they have not changed on women's rights, because as you can see, they have sent back women workers. They are, I don't want to go into this, but there's a lot going on, and people have been asking me, and I think we need to support the feminists. So it's very anthropological to think that you have to go into, which we have seen articles now, people going into villages and asking women, do you support the Taliban? It's like going into Texas and asking the average woman in Texas, who might be an average fundamentalist Christian woman, and asking her, do you think this abortion, this is good? You're going to find a handful of people who will come out and condemn the new law in Texas. You're not going to find the majority of people in Texas going out on the streets. It's exactly the same for other societies. In my own research that I did, and I talked to many only feminists in Pakistan, and I've cited in my particular article, they acknowledge that they are a small minority, but feminists think they are an important minority. And I personally think we should be supporting the women who are fighting for women's rights in Afghanistan, instead of looking for the native informant and going into villages and asking, yes, those women support the Taliban because Taliban are the only viable, the day-to-day violence in their lives has been stopped by the Taliban. But that doesn't mean that the Taliban have changed and they're or any other group, as in Pakistan, for instance. So sorry for that rant, but I think we need to be very, very, maybe we need to re-examine our own assumptions instead of jumping to, I mean, I think it's important to challenge racism and when, challenge these notions of Taliban and, being used. But I think it's, we need to think carefully about that. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, because I want to be mindful of the time. We're at 4 o'clock and we're going to go until about 4:20 so we can leave time for questions. So Zeynep, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to jump in, and I think it continues well from Amina and Minoo's contributions. So this moment of the anniversary of 9/11, as well as what's happening at that moment, of course, not coincidentally in Afghanistan, kind of intensifies and accentuates a kind of a central dynamic or dilemma or contradiction that I feel ongoing in my work as an activist and as a scholar in a dilemma, and I think a dynamic that we really wanted to open up in this issue, at least for the we want to take a step towards dialogue around that difficult issue, which is that, and there are many different ways to put this, but one way to put this is, say, so I'm a transnational scholar, right? Literally, so I have two worlds, Turkey and United States. In Turkey, I teach and, write against anti-Muslim racism. And I have to continue to talk about how Muslim women are not this one thing, and that, that essentializing that category justifies imperialist war and occupation, as well as, other things here. And that and critique this pseudo-feminist vision of that kind of pseudo-feminist racist mission to save women. At the same time, in my own country of Turkey, I'm spending time and conducting research and publishing, and I'm publishing that stuff in American journals in English, and so to some extent, sometimes more censored, or popular versions in Turkish, as to how a neoliberal Islamist government, in the name of Islam often, right, in the idiom of Islam, is justifying attacks on not gender and sexual minorities, but ethno-racial groups, as well as like feminist and queer movements. And then I'm finding myself all the time in this impossible place I'm feeling myself tasked with this impossible place to translate these, already historically mistranslated worlds into each other, and has to assist with kind of how to like get towards collectively, of course, a more nuanced understanding in the hopes of transforming the conversations. And then in this moment, it's such a painful moment, I think, for transnational feminism, as we see again, like this long history of colonial aggravation of women's situation in Afghanistan, and a kind of the co-entanglement of US imperialism and Taliban, which have been co-producing each other for a long time now. And then we are like, I'm quite speechless now at like this danger and loss that is facing Afghan women and feminists, Afghan feminists in particular, right? And I'm so frustrated that both in US and in Turkey, it is very difficult to untangle a feminist, or let me call quote unquote secular feminist position, from an anti-Muslim racist position. It is very difficult to address the entanglements of US empire and Taliban, of US imperialism, and the violence and oppression that Taliban exerts in the name of Islam in a way that is actually really responsive to the needs of both transnational feminists seeking in solidarity, but also of women and gender sexual minorities, and of feminists like in Afghanistan, right? So so I'm glad to have company for this. Yeah, I'll leave it at here. Just happy to be able to share this frustration. And I think that this only, that out of this frustration and intensification, I am only more committed to finding each other, to keep this conversation and to staying in each other's company, to keep this conversation happening, as we, even though at times it feels like we are kind of in the same place, and of course we are not in the same place at all in other ways, that we just have to keep on at it. And maybe Sherene wants to, you know, add to this. So.
You know, I'll just say quickly that when you pursue sort of race as your entry point, it doesn't mean that you have decided that those kinds of civilizational tactics are independent of kind of specific context. It just means that when you look at it with that lens, when you look at Turkey with that lens, or Pakistan, etc., what is it you see and what is it that you don't see? And I think that I would continue to advocate for keeping the racial lens when we look at these various political contexts, because I think it yields something different each time. And you know, it's not that it is the exclusive lens. It's just that it is a very productive tension to trace as one goes through trying to understand imperial contexts of war, etc. I have found, I mean, maybe I'm sort of partial to it as a critical race scholar, but I find that it yields very interesting and important insights into what is happening in these parts of the world, in much the same way that looking at things through the lens of gender does.
Tatiana, I saw your hand, and then I'm going to segue to ask the next question, which is relating to this. But
yeah, I'll be very brief. I just wanted to share some of my observations as I'm thinking about the anniversary of 9/11 and what is happening in Russia right now. In light of the upcoming parliamentary elections, I want to think about the expansion actually of criminalization, right? How, again, as Russia is waging its own war on terror and being a part of that, right, by intervening in Syria, now looking for new opportunities, imperial opportunities in Afghanistan, right, it has been criminalizing Muslim minority, right? But this criminalization has expanded now to include any form of opposition to the government, right? And the use of the words of extremism, right? So now any kind of opposition, mainly leftist, mainly anarchist, right? But also feminist and LGBTQ plus activists, right? Are labeled as extremist organizations, right? That present, you know, the civilizational threat, security threat. So, and I'm really curious to also see kind of those budding alliances and solidarities that are forming between those different groups, right? Seeing themselves as criminalized by the regime and often being imprisoned, right? We know about some of prominent opposition leaders and so many others who are now imprisoned by the Russian state. So I want to see what kind of work this criminalization does by kind of spreading its umbrella to include so many different groups struggling against all forms of precarity and vulnerability.
That's an excellent point, Tatiana. Thank you. So part of what we've been alluding to, but I want to really highlight it for us. I have a scripted question. I wanted to quote a recent article by our colleague Deepa Kumar that she published in Spectre, and I'm just going to quote and then ask her the question. She says, "When the suffering of Afghan women proved useful to the war on terror and to US imperial aims in South and Central Asia, they," meaning Afghan women, "became the subject of sustained media attention in the United States. In this process, a flattened monolithic female Muslim subject/victim is created." So some of you have already addressed this, but I would like you to reflect for us, how does your work, whether it's your scholarship, your teaching, your service, or your activism, engage with or counter that hegemonic narrative of the flattened monolithic female Muslim subject victim?
How does it not engage that? Is maybe the question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think to the point that Sherene was making too about, what happens when you apply certain analytic, but could you share further? Because remember, folks watching may not know what you do. So.
I'll just quickly say that in the late 70s, when I was in Vancouver, this car full of young white men drove by and yelled at me and said, "Damn Hindu." And I sort of almost fell off the pavement thinking, whoa, what is my response to this? Oh, wait a minute, guys, I'm not Hindu, I'm Muslim. You know, that's obviously not the response. And then every sort of 5 years, something changes about this, right? There was sort of like, you know, Paki bashing, there was whatever. Every 5 years is something different. And it forces one to think all the time, who am I? And how do I respond to this aggression? But quite apart from the personal focus, I think we're sort of always kind of asking that question as well, as we see these kind of circulating racial phantoms, you know, the Muslim woman as a monolith, the global terrorist, etc. We watch them in all their various incarnations, as sometimes they land on us and sometimes they don't land on us. You know, but I'm not sure about, you know, whether this moment when we're watching this figure, that the Muslim as global terrorist sits right next to the Muslim woman, you know, the Afghan Muslim woman who must be saved. And you just keep wondering sort of, how is this going to morph in the next incarnation?
Which also sits next to like the so-called jihad squad, for instance, which was some, you know, elements of the memes that I looked at also drew in this stereotype. And yeah, I think the fluidity of the ways that they can, to Deepa Kumar's point, you know, the ways that they can just be called up over and over again, cyclically in various moments, of course, points to both their longevity, their use in terms of building myths that will enable justifying various forms of colonialism and imperialism and so on.
So, you know, this question wasn't on the list I sent you, forgive me, but I think it's important, I realized, to ask Sherene and Zeynep and the rest of you as well. Sherene and Zeynep, but we were talking about this issue. You were quite insistent that, no, it's anti-Muslim racism as opposed to Islamophobia. And we spoke quite a bit about what are these two frames, how are they related, how are they different to each other, and why anti-Muslim racism specifically was the one that you went with for the issue. Could you share your thinking about that with everybody?
Zeynep, do you want to start, or do you?
Go ahead, Sherene.
So you know, this is a perpetual battle because there's no point speaking in a language that no one else understands. And Islamophobia has by far greater circulation than anti-Muslim racism. And one of the main reasons for that is that racism against Muslims is denied. It's called an imaginary racism, you know, which is what that idiot whose name I won't mention, but some of these French authors have been arguing it's an imaginary racism. Bad things are not happening to Muslims. In fact, Muslims are the people doing bad things. So when you're up against that, you really have to kind of insist, look, we're talking about a racial formation here, and it is traveling and you know, supporting these horrendous political projects. And so one has to become quite categoric about it. This is a racism. This is anti-Muslim racism. Let's get on with it. So that basically is our thinking, I think, around why insist on that term, because you know, how many times do we have to go down this rabbit hole of people insisting that this is about religion? You know, even though when you talk about it in those terms and you get very categoric and you sound like I'm sounding like a bully, you know, it's race or nothing, even though you have to think about religion, you just can't afford to let people get away with thinking that this is about religious difference. You know, and that I think it's a political choice really at this point, but kind of often feels like you're ramming it down people's throats because they will not have it.
Well, that actually segues very nicely to a question I did have, which was thinking globally then about anti-Muslim racism across the world. Because I think that's also a really important contribution of this issue, right? Is that, we're located in the US, Meridians that's where many of us are sitting in North America. But the point is that this is a global worldwide phenomenon that is fully transnational for the reasons that Zeynep was alluding to earlier in terms of the, I forget the word to use, but there was kind of the co-constitution, right, of the Taliban and the US imperialism and so forth. So could I ask you all to, again, or some of you, whoever is interested, to pick up this question of why it's so important to think about anti-Muslim racism as a global worldwide phenomenon and a historical one, because that's the other point, right, to the work that you've all done, which is this is not new. This is not simply a product of 9/11, et cetera, right? It's not just the war on terror. Who's terrorizing you, right? So I'll turn it back to anybody who'd like to maybe share some final thoughts before we open to any audience questions we might have, and any questions you might have of one another, by the way.
One thing I would add is that historically, anti-racist Muslim is not new, is not limited to 9/11. And we have to study it within the context of colonial modernity and how colonial modernity actually constructed Muslim otherness. That's something that I explain in my contribution. So it's really, for example, when you think about Iran, we have been racialized within the context of civilizational imperialism before even I became a diasporic person. So in that sense, it's the history of race and religion and what we call Mohammedanism in the context of 19th century, very polite, neutral, anthropological writing. So is it still continuing to invest value in the discourse of Islamophobia that is now being circulated. And unfortunately, being also used by diasporic communities who experienced, have been traumatized because of their, forced migrations. Now it's so easily digested by many diasporic communities. So it's really important to bring the historical past into conversation with what is happening right now.
Laura, were you going to?
Yeah, you can see me going towards the mute button. No, I was just thinking what Amina said about the longer history of US investment in Pakistan. And so I think it might be interesting for us to contrast it with the situation in India, where 9/11 gave license to a certain kind of anti-Muslim racism that, it had been there for a long time. But with the rise of the Hindutva movement in ideology, etc. So the recent legislation they've passed, targeting Muslims and Muslim immigrants, etc., that became possible after 9/11 in a way that wasn't so blatant before. So I think it's interesting to see. So in some parts of the world, this has been going on for much longer, the US presence and their involvement. And in other cases, 9/11 did mark, signal a break where it made possible this kind of identification of Muslims as terrorists who don't belong to the country, who need to be ousted. So I think, that is something that I think 9/11 did for many of these contexts where Muslims are a minority population, even though in India, a huge minority population in terms of numbers. So that was my thinking on sort of the history and transnational connections.
I just would like to add just one quick point, which is I love that the historian George Mossy, who was a historian of National Socialism in Germany, said, racism hitches a ride on any project going. And so, when you think of the Uyghurs, you think, dispossession is going to require this little hitchhiker called racism that will make it all possible. And this is the same thing in Palestine, and this is the same thing in various places. And I love that idea that racism hitches a ride on these larger projects, or fuels them.
Could you put the name in the chat for us, please? I think that's a brilliant quote. Somebody else want to speak to this question? Or do we have any questions from the audience, Melinda or Kyla, that So folks, this is a chance for you to ask a question if you have one. And I think I went through all of mine. Let's see. But I wanted to ask if you have questions of one another.
There was a comment in the chat by somebody who had to leave, Diane Langford, I believe. But I think it maybe even bridges from this question of transnationality, but also activism and protest, and then thinking about the question that you had asked around how are we thinking about things differently. So I think in terms of the movement that we may see, for instance, around solidarity or support for Palestine and things like this, and the sort of shifts on the ground and the ways that it feels simultaneously, I guess I would say, like nothing has changed and like things have changed, right? And so I don't know, that was just neither a question or a comment, but just trying to pull some of the threads together that folks have been saying and mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, I would hate to, so one of the other things that came of the 20th anniversary was that we did, while we had that comment and that reflection by Lisa Majaj about this continuing to be a problem, and by Suneera Thubani, and also Vivian May, who writes about Harriet Tubman and speaking about, anti-Black racism in the United States and just the ongoing nature of everyday and structural violence, et cetera, et cetera. There were also some really affirming and uplifting comments by Angela Davis and Cassandra Shaler, who've been involved in the abolition project for decades. And they were able to trace that, in fact, things have changed, right? That their efforts as activists and organizers and educators have produced some really tangible material outcomes, right? In addition to shifting consciousness, right? Which, not to be an old 70s feminist, but like that matters, right? You're reminding me when we're mentioning Palestine specifically that I wanted to take a moment to share the screen to show folks who may not have seen it yet, the beautiful cover art for this issue, which is an image, a painting by Malak Matar, who is a Palestinian artist, painter, who I had the privilege of hosting at Smith for Meridians event in February of 2020, just before the pandemic shut down our campus, and was looking for an issue that this image would work well with. And when this proposal came along, it just seemed like absolutely the right thing. So I just wanted to share that, because it reminds me, right, that those connections are there. Right? All right, we have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if you have any questions for one another or for me as editor of Meridians, if there's anything that I can share. I want to say, while you're thinking about that also, because Zeynep, your commentary about publishing and living across spaces and contexts and languages, that one of the things that I have been committed to as editor of Meridians is to publish text, and this can be snippets or quotes or citations or shorter pieces, et cetera, in languages other than English, and more importantly, other than European languages, right? Because Spanish, French, Italian, pretty much anybody can do that, right? But I've been grateful that DUP has partnered with me in publishing, for example, Arabic text or Chinese or Japanese, et cetera. So we welcome that, understanding that we have to do translation as well so that it's accessible to our larger body of readers. But the idea being that some things just aren't translatable, right? And some things need to appear in their original in order to really fully make sense. So hopefully we can do that more and more. Any final thoughts? Or I'm going to ask you to closing thoughts, closing questions, comments. We have about 6 minutes left. I want to make sure you had an opportunity to say what's on your mind in this moment.
I'll just make a quick comment from something Amira said. you know, I talked about how things haven't changed before, but I think one way that activisms are being connected is that people who were mobilized by the Black Lives Matter movement immediately saw the parallels with what was happening in Palestine, right? So I think the nature of the discussion around Palestine has changed among a certain populace, even in the West, in this country. So people, they saw, you know, the boots on the neck, etc. So all those images that are now possible because of technology, they saw the parallels and the similarities. So they recognized those things as problematic in a way that people wouldn't discuss in the past about the situation in Palestine. So I think that is a good thing that has happened in recent years. Much needs to be done, but I think people's awareness of the parallels is a really important change and a result of activism on the ground in both places. So,
and the work that we've done as educators, I think it's important to take a little bit of credit for that, right? So as counter-hegemonic educators, we're teaching to transgress, to borrow a phrase from our friend Bell Hooks. You know, I think we've had an impact. The Republicans are right. I'll take a little credit for that. Okay. Somebody else? I'd like you all to please take a moment to say some final comments. Shall I round robin call on you? All right, I'm doing it. Minoo.
I would say activism and academia are not separate for me from each other. I mean, what we do in our classroom, what we write about, the kind of communities we are creating, like the communities that we create, we collaborate with each other, are parts and parcel of our activism. And, you know, sometimes we have a tendency to separate academic work from activist work. And I truly believe in practice and in praxis and actually bringing theory and practice into conversation with each other. And it's truly important. I think decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing what we know is a huge task that is not going to end. We have to think constantly about these issues. We have to collaborate with each other. We have to write about these issues. This is not going to ending. And this is actually very hopeful for me. The kind of communities of scholars we create, we collaborate with each other, we work with each other, what we do in our classroom, those are truly important. And you see that as a consequence of that, a number of us have been blacklisted, right? Or there has been so many right-wing demonstrations on university, or the tenure system have been, you know, constantly challenged. So in that sense, we see the result of what we are doing, but also I am grateful for having you all here and working with you all.
Thank you, Minoo. Tatiana, can I pass it to you?
Just an observation from the classroom. I also think that all of us are doing incredibly important work, writing, publishing, but also our student body, I feel, has changed. Students are so receptive to those new perspectives. They're so hungry for those, other narratives. And the work that they take on after our classes is also incredible and very inspiring. The activist work that they join is just gives me so much hope and joy.
Thank you, Tatiana. Amira?
I guess I was just thinking again about the statements with which you opened this panel. So thinking about, I believe you began with the land acknowledgement and then asked us all to think about where it is that we're speaking from. So we could think about, Indigenous sovereignty, foregrounding that, thinking about keeping in mind barking dogs in the background, but also the impact of COVID on our lives and ongoing in so many different ways that will be rippling in ways that we can't even imagine still. And of course, like the commemorations and always remember let us remember that, as we were talking about how nobody remembers really the context of 9/11, of course, like always remember, or whatever it is the sort of like motto. So thinking about memory and the ways it gets used, but also the ways that, you know, emptied out and used as a kind of container, and how we can reclaim that or think about that. So grounding ourselves in that as well. And combating anti-Blackness and, you know, free Palestine. Those are my final comments.
Thank you, Amira. Amina?
I think I've spoken a lot today. But yeah, I agree that the student body has changed, but it is, as I've written in the chat, and I really believe that just the backlash against critical race theory means that it is having some of its intended effects. And we see that students are very interested in some of these things. They are more discerning. They are more critical. And so I think some of the work, at least some of the work that we are doing, at least the work that we are doing in the classroom and writing is having some effect.
Thank you. Zeynep?
I just want to thank Sherene, first of all, for this space of learning and collaboration, and, you know, being the colleague and scholar that you are, that has allowed us to do this, for all the contributors, and to our editor, Ginetta, and everyone participating today. Just like I told at length, but just I say I find this kind of scholarly academic community so valuable, so vital, so crucial. And I'm glad that we can be together to learn from each other, to be in solidarity.
Thank you, Zeynep. And last but certainly not least, Sherene.
Thanks. I mean, I echo Zeynep. I have to thank Zeynep. And as I told you at the beginning, it really was, you know, her phrase, mistranslations that led to all of this. And I've had over the years all kinds of profitable, you know, Amina is one of those, Zeynep is one of those people that sort of come at each other and say, look, where I stand, it doesn't look that way. And that, you know, leads to such productive things. I just want to say something about the fact that I've, you know, my years as an academic, I've actually never, I can't remember an event organized around anti-Muslim racism or dealing with similar issues that did not occur in a context where we had to worry about institutional sanctions or harassment. And this symposium that began this was no different. But it occurred at the time in the United States when Betsy DeVos and Trump, you know, they were sort of aiming for anybody wanting to have this conversation. And I'm always surprised at my own surprise, which I think is a good thing, that I'm, you know, constantly surprised that there's this attack. There were people who were afraid to participate in this symposium or to support it, which is extraordinary when you think about it. I continue to find it extraordinary, even though it's been so long standing that we can't even have these conversations without facing threat, facing censure. And the more vulnerable you are as an academic, the worse it is for you. It's a good idea not to have this conversation, etc. And so I really want to say that at the end, that we keep remembering, especially if you're like me and you prefer to forget the guns that are aimed at you, that we sort of keep remembering how those guns, they're sometimes literal guns, like when my, you know, or imprisonment, like when my friend Homa Hudfa was imprisoned in Tehran, you know, and interrogated about her feminist beliefs. But they also range to, you know, us trying to have a symposium or other people trying to get tenure and still insisting on talking about these things. I think this is so significant. And I want to say my thank you to everybody, just because we desperately need each other in order to have this conversation. And we most certainly need Meridians and spaces like that, because it seems that it's not quite so friendly out there. So I just wanted to kind of remind people that there are real risks that many people take. I count myself as the person taking sort of some of the least risks, but I'm constantly surrounded by people taking really big risks in speaking about this.
Thank you, Sherene. And it is in fact in the honor, right, of the risk takers, ourselves among them, that this conversation was held. And I appreciate you all making the time. I appreciate our audience members coming. We are recording it, will be online. And again, I just really want to invite everyone to keep an eye out for the issue. It's coming out by the end of this year. If you, for whatever reason, can't afford it, can't access it, please write us an email. Meridians does ship things out to folks who can't access the journal through institutional entryways, because we want everyone to be able to read what our brilliant feminist knowledge producers, artists, scholars, activists, etc., are honoring us with the privilege of housing in our journal, in our space. So thank you all again. May you be well, and may your work continue to transform the world. Have a good evening.